Hi guys and welcome. I'm finally back with a new video on this channel. I know it's been quite a while since I posted my last video on this channel. I've just been really busy doing other things, working on my own projects, and sometimes I was just lazy and not competent enough to put together a full YouTube video. But now I'm back and I'm in the mood to do new videos. I also thought of a new approach to do these videos. I do want to focus more on objective data rather than too much subjective listening or subjective impressions. And you will see that hopefully in the future, starting now. And I also want to make my videos a lot shorter than in the past. Some of my old viewers may know my really old videos were pretty short, but then they got longer and longer, up to 30 or even 40-minute reviews of different speakers. And there were some complaints. I never really agreed with it. However, I did change my mind about that, and I do want to make these videos a lot shorter. Right now, this is the beginning of the video. I have no idea how long the final project is going to be because I'm recording this voiceover before editing the video. I just hope it's going to be less than 20 or maybe even less than 15 minutes. That would already be a huge improvement. And speaking of this video, today we're going to have a bit of a vintage review. We're going to take a closer look at the Elac 305 speakers that I purchased around 1 to 2 years ago on eBay. They were released in 1995 and they used to be around 2,000 euros, so quite an expensive little bookshelf speaker. But by now you can already find them for about 200 to 300 euros on eBay, at least in Germany. I have no idea how common these speakers are in the US or in other countries, but at least here they are rather cheap. As you can see, the speaker still looks pretty good despite its age. The design language is rather modern. The colors are pretty nice as well. This is some kind of turquoise and it's also available in silver and red and many other colors. And this type of speaker or this speaker line is still continued to this day. Of course, with new updates, new drivers, new electronics, but they still sell a new version of the speaker today for around the same price, like 2,000 euros, which means that this speaker line must have been pretty successful. When I first got the speaker, I immediately noticed that it's pretty high quality. The housing is made from aluminum, which is pretty rare for speakers in general. It's kind of the distinguishing factor of the speaker. It makes it feel pretty sturdy, it's very heavy, and overall it feels pretty high quality and like a very solid speaker. Let's quickly run down the specs. As you can see, it's a pretty small two-way compact ported bookshelf speaker with a 4-inch mid-range driver that's made from aluminum and a 3/4-inch mylar dome tweeter. It seems like some kind of coated fabric material, I'm not so sure. And again, the distinguishing factor of the speaker is the enclosure that's made from aluminum. On the back you will find your 2 binding posts, no kind of bi-wiring, no bi-amping, and that's all I can say about it. Now let's get into the interesting part of the video, which of course is the sound of these speakers. In these new videos, or in my videos starting from now, I kind of want to have a different approach on speaker testing. I want to focus less on subjective listening and more on objective data, and I'm trying to kind of mix those two things together to give you a better impression of how one or another speaker might sound. First, I will tell you about my subjective listening impressions. When I first got the speaker, I sat down, I took a listen without having measured it. I just took some notes on how I like the sound and what I noticed, just judging by what I can hear. And after this, I went ahead and took some measurements of the speakers, which we're going to talk about in the second part of this video. The first thing I noticed when I sat down and listened to these speakers was that the sound is pretty bright. It has a kind of a raspy upper treble character. It quickly becomes annoying, even to me, who's someone who prefers a brighter speaker that has more treble compared to a more dull sounding speaker. The bass extension was pretty impressive, however. I was rather surprised that an old small speaker like this could provide such decent bass output. It's much better than the KEF LS3 5A, for example, and that was pretty decent. The overall sound signature can be described as modern. It's rather refreshing sounding. Again, a lot of treble, a lot of upper mids as well, and the bass seemed to extend rather deep. And I would say that's a pretty untypical sound signature for the time, as usually speakers back then sound a bit boomy with the upper bass hump or the BBC kind of tuning with a dip in the treble region, and this speaker showed none of these signs. Another effect that the forward response of the speaker brings are very pronounced mid contours, especially S sounds and just the details of the voice are very pronounced with the speaker. Again, a bit too much even for my liking sometimes. The lower mid sounded rather recessed, which led to some kind of V-shape sound impression. Not so much in the bass, rather, or maybe like a tilted up impression of the sound. So it sounded like it started off kind of neutral in the bass, and then it got louder and louder as the frequencies got higher. Another thing I noticed is that the speakers seem to have some pretty decent efficiency, which again can be explained with the upward tilt of the sound or of the frequency response, which you will see later. Usually when a speaker sounds brighter or has some peaks in the treble area, it will sound like it has higher efficiency, because that's where your ears are most sensitive. Overall, the tonal balance of the speaker isn't quite so balanced. It seems to have some kind of wow effect tuning, you know, extended treble, boosted treble, some peaks here and there in the mid regions, very pronounced vocals. Kind of a nice bass extension, I will say that again, but it's made for listening just for a short time and thinking, wow, the speaker sounds amazing despite it being so small. That's kind of the first impression that I got. In my honest opinion, it's not that bad. If you like treble and you get it used for 200, 300 euros, it certainly is a nice speaker. The bass extension is pretty good. Again, if you like a lot of treble, this speaker will be for you as well. Maybe if your ears aren't that great anymore, the speaker could be handy. And of course, the build quality of the speaker and the design is pretty nice. So 200 to 300 euros for this kind of quality of a speaker is a pretty good deal, I would say. Something else I noted down is that the upward tilt of the speaker's frequency response isn't really that noticeable if you listen to old recordings or bad recordings that tend to sound dull already. In that case, it can even be beneficial to have this kind of frequency response in a speaker, since it might add the necessary kind of, shimmer or clarity to bad recordings. But I'm not trying to make excuses. It's not my favorite kind of sound signature. I like flat sounding speakers, speakers that have a bit of extra treble sometimes, but this, you can hear it has some pretty obvious flaws. But if you only listen to old recordings and you like a lot of treble, a very forward sound, these speakers might be good for you. However, I think they have some pretty obvious flaws, and especially for modern music, good and balanced recordings, these flaws will become pretty obvious after a few minutes of listening. Something else I quickly want to mention before we get into the objective data of this review is the imaging. It sounds pretty good. It's a narrow baffle on the speaker, has some good dispersion, very small tweeter, small woofer that probably doesn't start to beam in its operating range. The enclosure is very solid, little vibrations, so the imaging is pretty stable, pretty nice. However, again, the obvious flaw of the speaker, the very forward response, the rising response, kind of makes the image very forward sounding. Some people again might like that, but for me it's a bit too much sometimes. And again, depending on what kind of music you listen to, it can become pretty obvious and rather annoying after a short while of listening. Now, after I gave you my subjective opinion on the sound of these speakers, let's get into the objective data and see how it correlates with what I just said about the sound of these speakers. Maybe it looks the same, maybe it says something completely different. Let's just get into it. But just before we get into the final measurements of the speaker, I want to give you a bit more of an insight into how I measure these speakers in my reviews starting now, because that method has changed recently. Back in my older videos, I just took normal in-room measurements with just some smoothing added using REW. By now I did find out some new things on how to measure a speaker properly, and what you will be seeing next is a gated response of the speaker down to about, I think, 300 Hertz with a microphone about 60 to 80 centimeters away from the speaker. And then I added the near field response of the woofer to the gated response, which should give you a pretty close to anechoic response. Of course, it's not 100% accurate. There are some other YouTubers who are using Clipple's near field scanner, which I would very much like to have, but it's rather expensive. So this is all I can manage with my measuring equipment I have here, and I think the results are pretty accurate. There have been some comparisons in different forums, comparing this measuring method to the Clipple near field scanner, and in some cases, especially the on-axis response, the results have been pretty accurate and very close. so I think it should definitely be enough to give you a rough idea of how the speaker sounds. But now let's take a look at the actual on-axis stitched measurement of the speaker, starting in the bass region. And here we can see the bass response of the speaker indeed is pretty nice. It reaches down to about 60 or 55 Hertz. After that it steeply rolls off, which I think is pretty impressive for a speaker that's this small and of this time. Until 300 Hertz the measurement looks pretty alright. Yes, it has a bit of a hump in the upper bass region, but I think that's still acceptable, especially with a speaker this small. It may make it sound a bit boxy, but it can also lead to a fuller sound, and it pretty much pales in comparison to what you will see next in the measurement. When we're talking about the mid-range, about 400 to 700 Hertz lower mid-range, you can see a bit of a dip, which is followed by a suck-out at around 900 or 950 Hertz, which is created by a cancellation from the port in the back, which you will see in the measurement now. That's only the port measurement, and you can see it really correlates with the suck-out in the on-axis response. Starting at 1 kHz, the speaker actually looks pretty good. Between 1 to 6 or 7 kHz, the response is in a window of plus minus 3 dB for sure, or even better, which is rather nice. But what you will see is that this whole area is on a bit of a plateau. It's a bit higher in output than the rest of the sound or the rest of the frequency spectrum below 1000 Hertz, which again leads to the forward character of the sound. It's louder by about 1 to 2, maybe even 3 decibels in some parts, which creates a pretty big difference between the sound of the upper mids and the sound of the bass and lower mids. From 7 kHz upwards, it rises up once again until it reaches plus 4 dB at about 10 to 20 kHz, which means it's 6 dB louder in the highest treble regions compared to the lowest bass regions, which creates a pretty big tilt in the overall sound balance, which leads to the sound that I just described in my subjective listening. Overall, I think the measurement on axis doesn't look too bad. The bass response looks alright, and the response above 1 kHz to about 7, maybe even 8 kHz looks pretty solid. I think they did a really nice job there. However, the step at 1 kHz already leads to a big issue in the sound, and then it doesn't really get better in the higher treble regions where it rises up even more, just creating even more clarity, brightness in the sound. Another aspect of the speaker that this reveals is the kind of fake high efficiency, which I mentioned before in my subjective listening test, which is created by this exact step in the response. You can see the overall treble area above 1 kHz or upper mid treble area above 1 kHz is on average about at least 2 dB louder than the area around 50 to 1 kHz or 50 Hertz to 1 kHz. And this just creates the impression of the speaker being louder and more efficient because your ear is most sensitive above 1 kHz, when in reality the average sensitivity of the speaker isn't all that high. Next, I went ahead and took some off-axis measurements of the speaker horizontally and vertically. This time I was not using REW, but instead used my new measuring device, the Clio Pocket. In my opinion, it's not really superior to REW, it's more different. When I want to work fast on my own projects, or if I want to take those kinds of measurements, it's a bit easier to work with because it measures quicker and has some advantages compared to REW. But on the other hand, REW is more powerful, I would say, or the software is more powerful. You can do some other nice things, like for example stitching different measurements. I'm pretty sure you can't do that in Clio, or it's definitely way more difficult than to do in REW, and that's why I decided to settle with Clio for these kinds of measurements and use REW for the rest. But again, not too much talking, let's just look at the measurements. First, you can see the horizontal off-axis measurements of the Elacs. I'm not exactly sure about the angles. I just randomly moved the microphone in small increments to just get a rough idea of how the speaker performs off-axis, but it's pretty close to 15 degrees, 30 degrees, 45 degrees and 60 degrees off-axis. And as you can see, the overall response looks pretty nice. I mean, with speakers of this size, it's pretty rare to see a horrible off-axis horizontal response. And as you can see, there are no big errors. The only problem I would point out is the upper treble, starting at about 8 kHz to 20 kHz. Despite moving off-axis, it never really rolls off. It always stays there as a kind of peak. What I would recommend, however, for placing these speakers, in case you already own them, is to not point them directly at your ears, not toe them in, but rather let them fire out into the room. As you can see off axis, the presence area above 1 kHz kind of drops down to a more even response that matches the lower mids and bass of the speaker nicer. So if you slightly toe them out, not listening to them directly pointed at your ears, maybe you have a chance of getting a slightly more balanced and linear response. Next, let's take a look at the vertical off-axis response. For these measurements, I moved the microphone above the speaker, again in increments of about 15, 30, 45 and 60 degrees. And as you can see, the measurements don't look that nice anymore, but to defend the Elacs here, it's normal for a two-way non-coaxial design to have these kind of suckouts if you move above and below the speaker vertically. So this isn't too crazy. When you only move your ears or the microphone slightly, you can see the response remains alright. However, if you move your ears a lot above the tweeter, about 60 degrees from the tweeter axis, you can see a pretty strong suckout at almost 3 kHz, which happens to be the crossover region of the two drivers. When moving below the tweeter or listening axis of the speaker vertically, you can see an even bigger suckout already at slightly lower angles. I think that's 45 degrees. The yellow line, we can already see a much wider suckout, which is then followed by an even steeper suckout again at around 3 kHz when you move about 60 degrees off axis. Next, I move the microphone really close up to the individual drivers to get their single response and to then create a waterfall plot to see if they have any ringing going on. But this also revealed the rough crossover frequency between the two drivers, which is around 2.5 to 3 kHz. That's regular for a standard small two-way bookshelf speaker, but I just thought I would let you know. Now you can see the waterfall plot of the woofer, and I will just be honest, I don't really know if I did this properly. I read the tutorials and the instructions for the Clio Pocket, and it looks like I did everything properly, and you can't really see any strong resonances from the woofer, which surprises me a little because it's an aluminum cone woofer, and especially back in the days with old aluminum cone drivers, they kind of had a bad reputation because they had a lot of ringing going on already in the audible range, in the mid-range, but there's no sign of such ringing with this woofer, so I guess it's fine. And I couldn't detect any ringing from the woofer audibly, but I just thought maybe it has some problems in the upper mid-range, but there's nothing visible here. Next, you can see the tweeter, and with this one you can see some ringing at about 10 or 12 kHz, and again some more ringing close to 20 kHz, but I would say that's pretty neglectable since in these frequency ranges your ear is very insensitive, and a bit of ringing or I guess cone breakup from the tweeter doesn't really matter that much. Lastly, let's take a look at the impedance graph, plot, measurement, whatever, of the Elac speaker, and you can see it looks pretty nice. Of course there's a bit of a hump where the tweeter comes in, but generally it's a 4 ohm load dipping down to about 3.9 ohms at 250 Hz. The tuning frequency is at around 60 Hz, which correlates to the bass that you get from the speaker, and overall there are no clear signs of any enclosure resonances that would be visible with a small peak in the impedance graph, so there's no such thing here. I guess the enclosure does do a pretty good job at reducing resonances and keeping everything intact. And these were pretty much all the measurements I took of the speaker so far, and all the measurements I can take of different speakers so far. I'm really sorry if the scaling or the resolution of the different measurements look kind of weird. I'm doing this voiceover before editing the video, so I have no idea how the graphs are going to look, but I think it's definitely enough to give you a visual idea of how the speaker sounds. Of course, in the future, I'm working on advancing my measuring methods even more to give you even more insight into how the different speakers behave, and of course also to advance my own speaker designs that I'm working on. I was thinking about maybe collecting even more data, especially off-axis from different speakers, and then putting them together to create a whole spinorama graph or a spinorama plot, I don't know how to call it, but so far I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it, so it's just going to get better from here, I hope. But I think again these measurements should be enough to give you a rough idea of how the speaker behaves overall, how it sounds off axis, if there are any resonances, any ringing, and so on and so on. One thing, however, that cannot be measured, at least not by me, is the quality of the parts of the speaker, or the quality of the parts in the crossover. And yes, I do believe the different parts do sound different. Whenever I build my own speakers, I try many different parts of many different levels of quality, and the higher you go in quality, the better the sound is going to be in the end. I know it's a pretty big debate in the audio world, but I know for a fact that different parts do sound different. Just because they have different electrical properties, they produce a different sound. Unfortunately, when I took apart the speaker, which I'm planning on doing at the end of every speaker review if possible, I did not manage to get any video footage of this particular speaker. The only thing I have as proof that I took the speaker apart is one picture done with my iPhone, so I'm just going to show that to you now. And that's the crossover of the speaker. You can see the parts are pretty bad looking. They're the cheapest parts that you can find, and for 2,000 euros it's not really the nicest looking crossover. You can see really cheap sandcast resistors, even in front of the tweeter, even for the tweeter circuit. You can see, I think that's an iron core inductor for the woofer, an air core inductor for the tweeter I assume, and only electrolytic capacitors for the entire crossover. Again, even in the tweeter circuit where the different parts quality is the most noticeable. Overall, this crossover did not really convince me. I'm sure that if they used better parts, they would have achieved a nicer sound. I mean, maybe it's not that bad of an idea to use sandcast resistors in the tweeter circuit, since they usually make the tweeter sound a bit more dull, and with such an elevated tilted response, maybe a better resistor would have led to even more treble. So I'm not sure what they were thinking. I just think they want to save money, and that's why they put in the cheapest parts they could find. For 2,000 euros, that's definitely underwhelming. As an advice to anyone who's already owning the speaker, who wants to maybe improve the sound and not sell the speakers, you could definitely take apart the crossover. It's pretty easy. You just remove 4 screws from the back. It's just an MDF back. That part is not made from aluminum. You can take out the crossover and the crossover board, and you can simply exchange the parts for high quality parts with the same value. So instead of using these resistors, you can use metal oxide resistors, or just nice polypropylene caps, especially in the tweeter circuit. That would be recommended, and then you can see and try out if maybe that improves the sound. Now the video is almost over. I hope it's not over 15 minutes yet. I have no idea. I've just been talking forever, and when I edit the video I will see. But there's one last thing that I want to show you, or I don't know, demonstrate to you, which is a small sound example. I know I said I want to focus more on objective data, but that does not mean that I will not use my microphones anymore to give you a short sound impression of each speaker. They won't be as long as they used to anymore, and there won't be that many different songs, also related to copyright, since most of my old videos got banned in different countries after I uploaded them. So they have been available everywhere for a few months, but then the copyright holder of the different songs filed a copyright claim, and my video got deleted, and that's pretty annoying. So I will make sure to use songs that are non-copyrighted, that I'm allowed to use, just to give you a short example to listen to yourself and maybe roughly get an idea of how the speaker sounds. And I think together with my subjective description of the speaker as well as the objective data, that should give you a pretty good overall impression of how the speaker will sound if you are interested in buying one for yourself. For this sound test, however, you are required to put up your headphones, and that's because I'm still wearing my good old binaural microphones to give you the most realistic sound impression possible. Of course, it's not perfect, but I think it does do a pretty good job at representing how the speaker roughly sounds. Usually when I listen back to my final video in my editing program through my reference headphones, the sound that I recorded is pretty close to the sound that I actually get in my room, so it's not that unreliable, to be honest. So now, after this disclaimer, please put up your headphones and enjoy the short sound check.
Is it just a dream of having me inside my fantasy? Come to me. You are in my thoughts. I never stray from the heart of you. Come to me.
So I hope this recording could help you to get an even better impression of how the speaker sounds. In my opinion, the recording sounds pretty close to what the objective data shows and what I told you in the subjective part of this video. And that's been it pretty much. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you like the new format that I'm doing these videos in. Again, I have no idea how long this video is. I hope it's at least going to be under 20 minutes. I have no idea. But I will try to make the videos shorter and shorter in the future. I will try to upload a bit more. I don't know what's coming in the future. Maybe I will have less time. Maybe I will have more time. I just hope I will have enough time to post some interesting videos here and there. I hope I could give you a good impression of how this speaker sounds if you were interested in it, or just for entertainment. I don't know. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel to don't miss out on any uploads in the future. And until then, have a good time and I will see you in the next one.